Good morning, everyone. My name is Jacob Gordon. I'm the president of the Alachua County African and African American Historical Society, Inc. Before I go any further, I'm going to try to comply with one of our traditions. Traditions that started in Africa, we brought it down here to the Americas. We have an honorary chair for this occasion, and she'll be presented by Dr. Barbara McDade Gordon, Professor Emeritus, University of Florida. Barbara.
Okay, thank you. I wasn't expecting applause, but I appreciate it. But before we start, as Jake said, we would like to ask permission to begin by our esteemed elder, Mangyne Vivian Washington Myler.
Good morning. Mangyne Amiami, Osuowaa, Okropong, the first Queen Mother, and I give permission to begin.
Thank you. Well, as Jake said, these have fogged up just a minute. I have the distinct honor of introducing a person who needs no introduction. Mangyne Vivian Washington Myler. She received the title of Mangyne when she was installed as a Queen Mother of North Central Florida last year. As she said, her official title in the Ghanaian Ga language is Mangyne na Amiami Osuowaa Okropong I, and it means mother who loves and protects all of her children. Some background to the meaning of this installment. In the 20th century, Ghana and other countries in Africa began to recognize persons who were esteemed in their communities in the African diaspora, who contributed much to these communities. Mangyne Vivian was selected for this honor. This past summer, she journeyed home to Ghana in West Africa, where she was acknowledged by the royal families as a Queen Mother and installed as an elder, another very high honor. For more than 40 years, Mangyne Vivian served as a nurse and nursing professor in Alachua County. But in her own words, she says, and I quote, "Nursing is my beloved profession. However, my legacy is teaching Black history and culture." She began this legacy at the age of 14 by speaking out in her community of Trenton, nearby where she was born, and she has devoted herself to preserving and disseminating the contributions of peoples of African descent and paying it forever forward. Mangyne is the founding chair of the Cotton Club Museum and Cultural Center. The museum opened in 2018. It is a collaboration inspired and powered by Mangyne over more than 2 decades. The Cotton Club Museum and Cultural Center is a 501c3 not-for-profit organization located at 837 Southeast 7th Avenue here in Gainesville, in the East Gainesville community. It's right down the street. It is a center for historic preservation, a stage for the visual and performing arts, an instrument of education, an institution of living culture, and a one-of-a-kind physical presence in our community. Through the museum and the strength of her devotion, we will continue Mangyne's legacy of preserving and teaching African and African American history and culture. I present to you my friend and our Queen Mother, Mangyne Vivian.
Good morning. I'm always inspired to hear Mangyne introduced. I keep looking around to see who in the world is that person that they're saying all of those nice things about. But I'm tickled black to be here. You can laugh if you want, but I'm serious. I'm never going to be pink. I can be as tickled as you are, and I love being black. So I think that all adds up. I hope you know that I can't be here with you all day. The parade is today, and I'm sorry, but I have an opportunity to ride in the parade with Shaq. And I don't mean, disrespect, but I will leave to go and do that. Langston Hughes wrote, "Freedom will not come today, this year, not ever through compromise and fear. I have as much right as the other fella has to stand on my 2 feet and own the land." I tire so of hearing people say, let things take their course. Tomorrow is another day. I do not need my freedom when I'm dead. I cannot live on tomorrow's bread. Freedom is a strong seed planted in great need. I live here too. I want my freedom just as you. I think those are befitting words to start this conference today, because freedom is more than a word. It's the land, it's our environment, it's where we eat, where we worship, where we live. And America is supposed to be the land of the free. I know that because my forefathers fought and died and lived in the unfree America. So how are we going to free our African-American race of people? We're going to free it by the kinds of things that Dr. Gordon and the rest of you are doing here today. We have to let you know that we own our place, we claim our place, we do not apologize for doing so. We have now in the museum, the Cotton Club Museum and Culture Center, an exhibit which is entitled Unapologetic 2. This artist is Yvonne Ferguson, who is a local artist. We exhibited her work about 2 years ago when she exhibited Unapologetic 1. And she showed people, African-American descent, through all aspects of our lives in portrait form. And they were not apologizing for being Americans. They were claiming their place as Americans. This exhibit, she has included some of the same people, but she has colored them in now with different hues, red and green and blue, because she wanted to show what struggles were placed before them. So she wanted you to look at them and see, unapologetic 2, I'm still here. I'm still fighting. What I have fought for is still here, but the job is not over. And now where we're living in this era and in this day, we know the fight has to just intensify. I'm proud to be Mangyne na Amiami Osuowaa Okropong I, but I'm also proud to be a little black girl who was born in Trenton, Florida. I'm proud to be one of the first women in the Gainesville Women for Equal Rights, the first integrated group of women in Gainesville. I'm proud to have marched down University Avenue in protest. I'm proud to have been the one who led the integration of Alachua General Hospital, who led the first fight there. But I'm a fighter, but I'm not the only fighter. I'm appreciative of the fighters that are still here and still going on. So I wish I could be here for everything, but it is being televised. I shall see everything, and once Shaq and I get through having our tete-a-tete, I shall return. Thank you so much for the opportunity.
And now it gives me great pleasure to introduce to you the moderator of this session, the keynote session, Dr. Agnes Leslie, a master lecturer at the University of Florida, as well as the outreach director at the Center for African Studies. She is also the vice president of this great historical society. Agnes, please.
Wow. Thank you all for being here. This is great. It's wonderful. When we were thinking about this last year, we didn't know that it would come to this. But I'm really delighted as the Vice President of the African and African American Historic Society to welcome you to this event. Thank you so much for being here. I recognize some of our students, so wonderful to have you. And friends, of course, thank you for being here. I'm delighted to welcome you on behalf of the African and African American Society. My role is to introduce our distinguished keynote speakers. We're so fortunate to have 3 distinguished speakers here. I'll introduce all of them at the same time, and then I'll invite them to come and speak for 20 minutes. So the first keynote speaker is Dr. James Cusick. He is the curator of the P.K. Yonge Library of Florida History and the Special Area Studies collections at the George Smathers Library at the University of Florida. He is the incoming president of the Florida Historic Society. He has a PhD in anthropology from the University of Florida, Yale Gators. He is specialized in historical archaeology and works primarily on the history of colonial Florida. He is the author of several publications, including The Other War of 1812, The Patriot War and the American Invasion of Spanish East Florida, published in 2007. He is working on another manuscript, Colonial Crime, Cases from the Records of Spanish East Florida. Our second keynote speaker is Dr. Jane Landers. She is also a University of Florida graduate in history here as well. So these were 2 actually classmates, or schoolmates at least. She is the Gertrude Conaway Vanderbilt Professor of History at Vanderbilt University. Dr. Landers specializes in colonial Latin America and the Atlantic world. She is the director of Slave Society's Digital Archive. She is a member of UNESCO International Scientific Committee for the Route of Enslaved Peoples Project, entitled Resistance, Liberty, and Heritage. Dr. Landers is the author and co-author of several books, articles, and book chapters, including The African American Heritage of Florida, published in 1995, Against All Odds, Free Blacks and Slave Societies of the Americas, published in 1996. Black Society in Spanish Florida, published in 1999. Colonial Plantations and the Economy in Florida, published in 2000. And our third speaker and keynote speaker is Dr. Anthony Dixon. Dr. Dixon is a public historian on African and the African American diaspora. He has a PhD in history from Indiana University. He is the founder and the president of Archival Historic Society and Associates. He serves as the archival consultant for several museums and libraries, as well as the lead historian and content expert for the state of Florida museums. He has published enormously. His publications include Up From Incarceration, Dispelling the Myths of the Thug Life, published in 2013. Florida's Negro War, Black Seminoles and the Second War, 1835 to 1845, published in 2014. And thirdly, a timeline of the African American diaspora experience in Florida, also published in 2014. Please, let's welcome our keynote speakers. And with that, I call upon Dr. Cusick. Please, Dr. Cusick, you have 20 minutes. Thank you so much. And thanks again for being here.
Thank you, Dr. Leslie. Thank you, Professor Gordon, and the African and African American Historical Society and the Matheson for organizing this. Welcome, everyone. My task this morning is to talk to you a little bit about the Native American peoples of Alachua County, and I'm going to be focusing on 2 historically known peoples, and that's the Patano that we know from the 1500s and before, and the Seminole, the Alachua band of Seminole, who established settlements in this area in 1740 and lasted until about the time of the War of 1812. Okay, here you see a poster of Florida by Theodore Morris. And if you look up in the top center, you can see kind of an icon for the Patano. The Patano their home territory was essentially what is now Alachua County. This was their homeland. And, oops, I'm sorry, I'm going the wrong way there. There we go. We're fortunate in knowing a little bit about their background from archaeological work that's been done in the county. Here you see an early schematic of the University of Florida. That's actually a rendering of a layout of the university that was never actually implemented. But in the center, you can see University Avenue there. You can see an open space, which would be today's Plaza of the Americas. And off on the far left, you see farmland and open land. And way off beyond the frame of that is the UF Law School. But on the property of the UF Law School is a burial mound, a Native American burial mound that's associated with the Patano and their immediate forebears. That mound was out in agricultural land and unfortunately was very heavily impacted in the 19th century by plowing and farming. It was excavated or partially excavated in the 1880s, and then someone dug right in the center of it at some other period. And it was finally investigated by the Florida Museum of Natural History in the 1970s. By that time, the mound, which originally was about 8 feet high, was less than 2 feet high. There was very little remaining to it. But because of that excavation, we know two things. We know that the mound was built over a campsite that dates to between 500 BC and 200 AD. It was of the Deptford culture people. They were probably here in Alachua seasonally. They were probably in that area because it's very near to Lake Alice, which would have been a good area to hunt and fish in. And then around 950 AD, a culture known as the Alachua culture began to build a mound there and to bury their dead there. And the Alachua people are the immediate predecessors of the people we know as the Patano. Here from chronicles of the French colonization of Florida in the 1560s is a depiction of Timucua Indians, part of the group that the Patano belonged to, gathered around a mound. So they were this was part of their tradition. They were a mound building culture. They buried their dead in mounds. You can see a drinking shell, a conch drinking shell on the top of that mound. Again, we know from excavations of mounds that in fact whelks and conch shells are sometimes found in the upper layers of those mounds as drinking vessels. So this very clearly ties the people that we know as the Patano to this mound culture. Here from the same work, which was published in 1591, I'm showing you a map of Florida with what Europeans knew about Florida at that time. And I've put a big yellow arrow on that map. And the reason for that is just to highlight this detail, which I have circled in red there, which is a lake with a little village or town icon next to it, and the word Patano. All right. That site is actually been discovered and investigated archaeologically, and it's here in our county down near Orange Lake. That's the lake that was on the map. These are some of the sites that have been investigated related to the Patano. There's the Richardson site. That's the one we're going to talk about in a minute, which is the Patano site. There's the Fox Pond site, which is up between Devil's Millhopper and San Velasco Hammock, which was a later Spanish mission site in Patano territory. There's also the Zetrower site, which is just south of Rochelle, which seems to have been a village that was associated with the main Patano site. And here from archaeological report from 2012, 2014 is the Richardson or Patano site on the northeast corner of Orange Lake, down south of Evanston. This site was investigated numerous times by the University of Florida and then by Willett Boyer in 2012 through 2013. And from those excavations, we know it's a large town that predates European kind of incursion into this area, but also has a church with Christian burials on it from a later Spanish mission site. And Patano is mentioned in the early chronicles. It was one of the sites that the De Soto army went to in 1539. It's in the chronicles from that period. It was the second and largest town in this region of the Patano that De Soto visited. The chronicles describe about 5 major towns in what was then Alachua County associated with the Patano from that time period. This is from a different report that looks at trails and roads that went through what's now Alachua County at that time. And what you can see there is that there is a western road that goes north. It actually goes right by the Fox Pond or San Francisco de Patano site and goes off towards Tallahassee, towards the Appalachia region. There's another one that goes right by Orange Lake and then up towards what would eventually become Georgia. And then there's what became the Mission Road going east-west across the top. What this tells us is that Patano were living in an area that was a big crossroads with lots of people traveling through it. And this was actually very good for that culture in times of peace because it meant that they had trade routes and they could trade things, but it also meant that the area was very vulnerable in times of warfare because a hostile force could move down one of these roads, these well-marked trails, and it would lead them straight to a population center, right? Which meant that the Patano always had to be ready to defend themselves. Those are land routes, but of course the other big thing in this area is there's a lot of water, and the Patano would have used water routes and would have transported and moved things about by canoe. We know that canoes are very important in this area because so many canoes have been recovered archaeologically from Noonan's Lake from all time periods in history. And the Patano probably, they're mentioned as being one of the most populous, one of the more powerful of the Timucuan-speaking peoples. And that's probably because they had a heartland that was rich in resources, could sustain a large population with hunting. They were agriculturalists. They grew corn and squash and beans. Interestingly enough, they also controlled access to chert or flint, which is found in this area to the western part of Alachua County. And chert, flint, was a very important resource in prehistoric and early historic times because it was what people made tools from, it's what you made spear points from, it's what you made arrow points from, and it would have been something that would have been highly valued for trade out of the area. And it seems like the Patano people were the ones who gathered or quarried or traded this material. Now, after De Soto's visit, De Soto, when he came, marched very quickly through Alachua, through Patano territory. He seized captives from the Patano because he was searching for food, and he wanted these captives to force compliance for the villages to give food. He had about 150 men with him. They got in skirmishes with the Patano at a place called Malapas, which was a little bit north of that Richardson site. And then they seized the summer corn crop from the northernmost Patano town before moving off into Appalachia territory. This was a hostile encounter with the Patano, and most of the ensuing encounters with the Europeans were also hostile. After De Soto went through, the Patano enjoyed maybe 25 years of peace without other Europeans moving in. But when the French established their colony over on the St. Johns River in 1564, they allied themselves with another Timucua-speaking group, the Utena. And they aided the Utena in making a raid on this territory, on the Patanos territory. And again, from that same account of the French colonization of Florida comes this image, which is the forces of the Utena with their French allies on the left and the defending forces of the Patano on the right, depicting this major kind of skirmish in this area. That ended in kind of a stalemate. But from that point on, the Patano were certainly no friends with the French colonists. They also were not friendly with the following Spanish colonists of St. Augustine. And the relations between the two were so bad that in 1584, 20 years after this, the Spanish sent an expedition to this area where they burned that town of Patano, the one at the Richardson site. And it was only in this early 1600s that the Patano made kind of a rapprochement with the Spanish and asked to reoccupy that site, which then was turned into a mission site. And there were ultimately 4 mission sites, Christianized sites in Patano territory, and you can see them there. The number 1, which is the northernmost one, that's San Francisco, which is up near San Velasco Hammock. The southernmost one is the site that we've been talking about, the site of Patano, which became San Buenaventura. And then there were 2 that were actually up in what would now be northwest Gainesville. These sites had a total population, or the area had a total population around 1650 of about 3,000 people. There was already a decline from what it had been there when in the 1530s. And about a third of that, about 1,000 of those people were Christians at the missions. Again, the mission period was fairly peaceful up until the middle of the 1600s, when a governor in St. Augustine, Diego de Rebolledo, wanted reinforcements for St. Augustine, and he sent word to the leaders of the Patano that he wanted them to come with their men, and because there wasn't a lot of food in St. Augustine, he wanted them to haul with them enough food to sustain each of them for a month. This was a nearly impossible task, right? And the Patano had no intention of deserting their towns and hauling all this stuff to St. Augustine. And several of the leaders got together and they rebelled against the Spanish. They killed several soldiers and some settlers in this area. They fortified a town to defend themselves, but ultimately they were defeated. The revolt was suppressed by the Spanish. And San Francisco de Patano, for example, was destroyed at that time, rebuilt a few years later. And ultimately that had a very devastating effect on the population in this period. The Patano never really recovered from the suppression of that rebellion. They still occupied this area, very small populations. They did rebuild some of the towns. San Francisco was reestablished and reoccupied. But ultimately what happened is that their population met the same fate as all the other mission populations across northern Florida, which is in another period of conflict, this time between the Spanish and the English of Carolina. The English swept into this area with Native American allies. They attacked these mission systems. They killed part of the population. They drove off part of the population. They captured part of the population and took it back north to sell people into slavery. And by 1702, 1706, most of Middle Florida was depopulated. People were fleeing towards St. Augustine or just out of the area because of these constant raids. And that was also what happened to the missions here in Patana. They were all destroyed at that time. And the area went into a period of kind of a depopulation, kind of a vacuum. That is, unfortunately, we were talking about fighters. The Patana were definitely fighters. We were talking about freedom. Ultimately, you know, this 100-year period of early colonial rule here did not result in freedom for the Patana. They fought desperately for their freedom, but ultimately they became exiles or from their own homeland. I'm going to move on then briefly to our second population. And this was the Alachua band of Seminoles. There's a lot of information about them on the walls here in the room at the Matheson. The Seminoles came into the area around 1740 and began establishing settlements at this time. These are images from the works of William Bartram, from his travels and from his sketches. And you see there one of the Seminole leaders, that's Long Warrior, who had a village to the west of us. You also see one of Bartram's images of Payne's Prairie with the Alachua sink, kind of that dark hole up near the top. Probably hard to see in this, I'll use this one instead. This is the second rendering of Payne's Prairie, but down the south where I've got it circled in red, that is Cowkeeper's Town. That's the town of Cuskawilla. You can see it's near water. It's right east of a lake. This is another town that's also known historically and archaeologically here in the county, the town of Cuskawilla. It's immediately south of Micanopy. And again, interesting thing about the Seminole occupation of this area is if you look, that circle at the left there, that's Cuskawilla, that's the Seminole town. But if you look, they settled in exactly the same lovely kind of heartland area that the Patano had settled, put most of their cities in, like down by Orange Lake, you know, with Noonan's Lake to one side, down south of Rochelle and near Evanston. That's where the Seminoles settled as well. It had all the advantages that it had during the Patano period. It had some additional advantages for the Seminole, which is it was good grazing land. And the Seminole, the name Cowkeeper might clue you in, the Seminole were, Alachua Band of Seminole, they were expert breeders of cracker ponies and cracker cattle. In fact, their herds in this area were so extensive that they supplied the breeding stock to all the ranchers around St. Augustine. All the ranchers, Spanish, American, British, they got their breeding stock from the Seminole. They also got their cracker ponies from the Seminole that they used for like their militias and their dragoons and things. So the Seminole established themselves very quickly and very solidly here. This is from a later period, from the 1840s, but it gives you maybe some idea of what Seminole structures and Seminole towns would have looked like, very similar to Creek towns. Again, Cowkeeper was a very powerful leader in this area. He was succeeded by Payne, probably related to him as a nephew. Payne moved the main town a little bit and created Paynestown, but also was a very well-established population here, frequently visited. Again, this area was a crossroads. It was still a crossroads, and so people came into it a lot. William Bartram came to visit several times. Traders in the deerskin trade would come and go. And so the Seminoles in this area, they had the same issue that the Patano had, which is that in times of peace, and they were very good at being diplomatic and maintaining peace with the people around them, they did very well. But in times of war, those same trails were there. The Alachua Seminole, they were a very independent group. They didn't associate too much with the Creek Confederacy further west or with the Seminoles at Lake Miccosukee. They sort of stayed to themselves, but they were a small group, you know, a couple thousand people. And when faced with overwhelming force, they, you know, had a difficult time defending themselves. They did very well up until the War of 1812. And then in the War of 1812, you had two forces from Georgia come into this area. One directly east from St. Augustine under Daniel Noonan. The Seminole under Payne managed to beat back that invasion force and sent it back east. That was in 1812. But the very next year, a much larger force came down that historic trail that led from Georgia down into Alachua. They came straight down that trail. And of course, it led them straight to Paynestown. And at that time, Bolek was in charge of the Seminole and did not try and oppose this group. They were too well armed and too extensive, so the Seminole evacuated the area, and that group burned Paynestown, burned the fields, confiscated all the horse and cattle. And from that point on, the Seminole did not really settle again in the heartland of Alachua County. You can see here from 1832, there was a reservation assigned to Miccosukee and Seminole people that was right south of us. The Seminole were always a presence here. Some of the early conflicts of the Second Seminole War took place down around Micanopy. But the Seminole didn't try and reoccupy or resettle the area, and Alachua then became kind of pioneer territory. I'm going to end there. I just want to say thank you again, and also that we should remember as we move forward with our county that this county is a burial place for two indigenous groups of people. And we should always be respectful of their sites. We should be respectful of those burial spots, and hopefully of our conservation and forest spots too. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Cusick. Our next keynote speaker is Dr. Landis. Please come down.
Thank you. That was really interesting, Jim. Thank you. So I'd like to thank Dr. Gordon and also the Alachua County African and African American Historical Society for this invitation to get to be here with you all today on this Bicentennial Symposium. See my old classmates and my old professors and my old dance company people as well, so it's nice. Thank you again for having me. All right, so I'm going to kind of segue from what Jim was speaking about and refer a little bit to my research as a grad student here. And I was coming to do Brazilian history, and I found wonderful documents about Florida's Spanish history, and I was interested in the issue of slavery and freedom, and so I diverted, and our wonderful mutual professor, Dr. Kathleen Deegan, helped me a lot because she got me money from the Black Caucus of the state legislature to send me up to Spain to look for all the documents, and we ended up doing the research on Gracia Real de Santa Teresa de Mose, the first free black town in what is the United States of America, over there in St. Augustine. And Jim and I worked together a lot in these classes, and so I'm indebted to all of that formation, which showed me that when you do historical research in the English records, you're just going to find property, and you're going to find people described as nothing more than property with no real lives. But in the Spanish system, it was completely different because it was based on an old Roman legal system that decided even enslaved people were human, had families, could not be separated, had rights to protest against cruelty, et cetera, and had rights to move out of slavery in a very different sort of system than what we might think about in the United States. So that early formation in those documents, in that different legal and religious and social system, carried me through, and I went on looking beyond, as we mentioned earlier. I had different books on this situation, and on the time periods. So today I was going to sort of try to follow up on what Jim's wonderful talk did and talk about how many of the overlooked, unknown figures we can dig out of these Spanish records that you could never get out of an English language source. And so that's what I'm always digging for, real individuals and their lives. And in this very rough frontier that when I'll come in is the Spanish period, you can see how many military contests took place from what Jim just told us. And what happens is there are very few Spaniards here. The Indian population is declining, and the African population is going to take a very big importance as military support for the Spaniards. If you had to choose one system or the other, you would choose the Spanish system because you knew you could get your way out for military service, self-purchase, owner's manumission, all sorts of different ways to move out of an enslaved condition in that world. And so we end up finding Africans allied with Spanish military expeditions from the very beginning. When Jim was talking about De Soto's expedition through here, I just had a National Park Service grant. I'm going off my paper script right now, but I got a National Park Service grant to research the Africans who were in those earliest expeditions, who went through all of these lower South states. And the Park Service is supposed to be now trying to introduce some of these real figures with their real lives and histories, including one African-American woman who survived that total trek and ended up floating down the Mississippi to finally end up in Mexico and go back to Spain and give her history of all the account of all those years. So just to say, through all that time period that Spain was in occupation of Florida, you can track from the early 1500s, first free black person to step foot in the United States, Juan Garrido, 1512, literate, wrote to the King of Spain, and so on. So just blow away all your ideas about Gone with the Wind and that sort of thing. We're going to go into a different world, okay? So Mosey was my beginning, but I moved forward in time as well. And many of the people that had come through Mosey were coming here looking for what I ended up calling religious sanctuary, because anybody that ran away from a Protestant colony to try to get to a Catholic colony and say they wanted to become Catholic, the true faith, then they would be liberated by Spain. And the international border was Florida. You know, that's, if you could get across to Florida. So Underground Railroad doesn't go north of Canada in the 19th century. It starts here. And so that policy that Spain institutes here in 1693 went throughout the Spanish Caribbean world. And so not only are people running from Carolina and Georgia down into Florida, but they're also running from Jamaica to Cuba, from Jamaica to Puerto Rico, and saying, please, I want to become a Catholic. And they would be liberated, welcomed into the community, and very often they would form free black militia units, which are very critical on this rough frontier. So again, I think it's quite a different story than you may be more used to by the visual images we get through film and popular culture, okay? So many of the people that we're going to talk about today, and sort of moving forward in time a little bit, they were black forces contributing to a series of invasions to defend against the United States. And free and enslaved people of African descent with indigenous allies as well, because Spain also had indigenous militias. They are all across the Lower South. We're talking about Florida today, but they're involved in the American and French revolutions, the Revolutionary Legion of the Floridas to liberate East and West Florida from Spain in 1795, the Muskogee War, that was William Augustus Bowles' War in 1800 to 1803, the Creek and Indian, the Patriot War that Jim has written a wonderful book on, 1812. It's not all, again, in Canada. We had another Patriot War here in Florida, 1812. Then Creek Indian War, 1813-14. First Seminole War, 1818, and Anthony's going to talk about the second one. But all through this long centuries of occupation here, that the Spaniards were here, there were also people of African descent, free and enslaved, living here, and many of them took these important geopolitical roles in the contests for what is now Florida. So here they come, and from 1693, this was law across the whole Spanish Empire. Run here, become a Catholic, and you are going to be free, and incorporated into the community. However, once the United States of America is formed, and our first Secretary of State is installed, Thomas Jefferson, he is going to put heavy-duty pressure on Spain not to allow any more runaways to leave English plantations and come in and become free. He doesn't want to drain the plantation south of their enslaved people. And so he's Secretary of State. He's an amazing character too, but he pushes Spain and says, if you want to be our friend, you will shut this down. And they do shut down the religious sanctuary policy in 1790. So we had it legally from 1693 to 1790, almost a century, in which many, many people risked it all to come down here, either in canoes like Jim talked about, or through the harsh landscapes here, often assisted by indigenous allies as well, to get into Spanish territory and become free. So here we had Thomas Jefferson shutting it all down, 1790. But in the meantime, we had, as Jim was telling us about, the formation of these new villages in the middle of Florida here in Alachua County, and the Seminoles are going to be a major player in all these contests as well. They had been incorporating runaway escaped slaves also into their society for at least a half a century, as you saw the images from Bartram and others. So-called Lower Creeks had accompanied Oglethorpe's big raid here from Georgia in the War of Jenkins Ear, as they called it, 1739 and 40, where they attacked and destroyed Mose, the first town. It's rebuilt later. Oh, and by the way, in February, supposedly, a fort will be built there by the Fort Mose Historical Society, my old friend back in the back, Thomas Jett. And you all should go over and see it, too. That's coming, we hope. Anyway, so we had destruction of that area and our first free black town in 1740. And some of those people end up also in these very lush savannas that Jim has described in the middle of Florida. The Treaty of Paris in 1763 is going to interrupt the first Spanish period, and Great Britain will come in. With it comes that horrible chattel slavery that you're more familiar with, where people are going to be considered property. And so in that time, Mose, its Spanish allies, its African allies, and its indigenous allies go to Cuba, where Jim and I have both tracked those populations as well. And the British come in, and they're going to make great big plantations like they had in Charleston. They're going to put people in the fields and treat them like property. But the Seminoles have created another option in the middle here. So some of them were allied, as Jim mentioned, with British. And others will not be. They will be more allied with the Spanish. So think of all the different options you had to decide if you were a person who had been enslaved. Are you going to try to run to a maroon swamp and live on your own? Are you going to ally with an indigenous force? Which one? Are you going to go to the Spanish? You're not going to go to the British. Okay, you wouldn't pick that one. All right, so where do we even get the word Seminoles is from the Spanish word cimarron, which meant a runaway. It used to be a cattle that escaped or something, and they say anybody that runs is cimarron, and that's where we got these terms for maroons. But Bartram, as Jim mentioned, visited all these places, and he talks about the great agriculture, the innumerable droves of cattle. He said also that place, the Seminole villages he visited, like Cuscawilla or Cowkeeper's Town, were tinctured with Spanish civilization. Some of the people wore little silver crucifixes affixed to a wampum collar around their necks or suspended by a small chain upon their breast. Catholic priests had already visited several of those missions, as Jim points out, and some of the Seminoles spoke Spanish and were familiar with all the Spanish geopolitics. So despite earlier affiliations under Chief Cowkeeper, Seminoles were, for that period, fiercely loyal to Britain. But after the British leave again in 1784, we're going to have a shift in geopolitics, and then we're going to see more connections to the Spanish system again. So everybody has to be alert to the changes in the politics and know what's going to be best for their possibilities. So Cowkeeper is succeeded by Chief Payne, which is Payne's Prairie, Payne's Town, and so on. His nephews and his successors were Micanopy and Bowlegs. They reshaped that Seminole foreign policy to ally with the Spanish government after the British leave in 1784. That has really big, important consequences for people of African descent. Earlier, the Seminoles had enslaved the indigenous Yamasee Indians who had come in here and had them as slaves, and apparently didn't think of them as very, worthy. But sometimes they also had enslaved Africans the British had given them as gifts in geopolitic negotiations. So they had had Yamasee slaves and enslaved Africans under that old system. And when we go through that chattel system and get rid of that, Chief Payne had already inherited, he and his group had already inherited some people who had been enslaved under Cowkeeper's group. So there were still enslaved Africans in those villages. And Chief Payne himself was said to, quote, own 20 black slaves, large herds of cattle, horses, sheep, goats. And there's been archaeology there, as Jim mentioned. Brent Weissman, who's one of the archaeologists who did that work, said that the additional labor provided by those enslaved people is what made the Seminoles wealthy. They had little English china tea sets out there that they bought because they had all this extra cattle and produce produced with their enslaved people. The Seminoles also regarded runaway slaves sometimes that they accepted into their communities differently than they thought about the ones that they'd either bought or somebody had gifted them. So runaways are accepted, and they have a different status than people who had been gifted or bought. And one important difference was that they had not conquered those people. Those people came of their free will there, and they were warriors, and they had critical military knowledge and useful skills that under the duress that you saw in Jim's talk, they really needed among both the small Spanish population and the small Seminole population. Both of those groups used and valued black military skills. How many? 5. Okay, let's see. So those Africans that had been incorporated into the Seminole Nation lived in fairly separate communities. They were sort of dual villages. Next to the chiefs, they would have their own village, and they would sometimes provide tribute in the form of either cattle or produce or service. And they were come to be known as Black Seminoles, which Anthony will talk about in a later iteration of them. So unlike the British, the Spanish people living in St. Augustine were not threatened by blacks living with the Seminoles. They had, as I mentioned already, black militias, Indian militias. They operated jointly all over this frontier ever since the 16th century, we said. And they would send out delegations to those Seminole villages, sometimes to buy cattle, as we said. And so you begin to see the exchanges of gifts and material goods like clothing, hats, thread and needles, thimbles, scissors, beads, pipes, knives, axes. All these are sort of luxury items. And we can find lists in the Spanish records of the gifts that were given to the Seminoles and what they valued. And one of the most interesting ones I ever found was red paper they gave to the children. I don't know what they did with it, but red paper. The men, the big men got saddles and important things like that. The women got all the needles and the beads and the stuff. And the little children got red paper. Anyway, so on 4 different occasions that I've been able to find, some of those runaway slaves, cimarrones, visited also St. Augustine, and there they get gifted and they get, feted at the governor's house. So it's a very different story than we're used to about both Africans and indigenous people and their intermixture in these Seminole villages, where they formed families that cross all these supposed racial divides as well. And I've written about in some of my books about people like the free black militiaman Juan Bautista Collins. He was one of the intermediaries in that trade between the Seminoles and St. Augustine. His mother was of African descent from Saint-Domingue, or what we would say today Haiti. And his father was a French planter in Louisiana, and he ends up here on our frontier, Juan Bautista Collins, as a sergeant in the Free Black Militia, kept account books in Spanish, English, and French. He traveled for the government of Spain to Havana, to Pensacola, to New Orleans, and to Payne's Prairie to buy cattle. So again, I hope I'm changing some of the narratives about how Africans lived on the frontiers, especially in the Spanish world. Another one of the fascinating fellows that I've come across, translators, an Anglo-Senegalese militiaman named Benjamin Wiggins. His mother was born in Senegal, where Dan Schaefer and I went looking for Anna Kingsley once, a long time ago, and his his father was English, and he came in multicultural, multilingual, and so on, a very important militiaman as well for the Spanish. Felipe Edinburgh, another one who was, they're all intermarried. I'm forming all these family groups with them and trying to track them all now. But I just am trying to basically change the narrative about how aware, elite, and multicultural, multilingual, and important these people were on the frontier. And they're not everybody barefoot in a cotton field somewhere, okay? So it's a whole different image. And the commonality is that all of these people wanted to keep the Americans from taking Florida. Americans are expansionist, and so Andy Jackson, right down the road a piece from my house in Nashville, was one of those figures who was determined to take Florida. For a while, he allied himself with indigenous people and even free black people from New Orleans. But he became the most driven of the expansionists and will become the territorial governor of Florida. And he writes in a letter that Jim helped me find in the P.K. Yonge Library. And then we're on to Cuba. He planned that they would take Cuba as well and expand plantation slavery there. So I had more to say, but maybe it'll come in questions and answers. But just to say that there are all sorts of these amazing characters that I've found in my research, Nero and Scipio and Tony Proctor. Leslie's going to have an article from him maybe. So all these amazing people who know much more, see much more of the world than sometimes, you mentioned cracker ponies, than cracker people. So thank you.
Good morning, good people. This research that I've begun in, basically the role of race and racism in Florida, the case of Alachua County, is based first on our concepts of African diaspora studies, which is, in my perception, based in 3 phases. The first is to provide a voice to the voiceless and give those stories and those people and those perceptions of views that had not been recorded. And this was the basic premise also of even my earlier studies when I did the Black Seminoles and the Second Seminole War. And I was asked what was I going to do or uncover about the Second Seminole War that hadn't already been written. And I told them probably nothing. The issue was, at 3 distinct periods during this war, the blacks were the primary objective, and that even the General Thomas Jessup writes back to the Secretary of War and says, this is not an Indian war, this is a Negro war. Yet no one had looked at the war from their perspective. And so that's the first phase, providing the voice to the voiceless. The second phase is making the cultural connections. As Jane has just spoken about these cultural interchanges, and James as well. And what are these cultural connections amongst the African diaspora, and then to the larger connections throughout the world. And then the third, which is using that information and why we do this research, which is to look at issues that we're facing today and how we use what we've done in the past and the lessons learned from the past in order to deal with issues that we're facing today. And that's the 3 main phases to African diaspora studies. So I apply that to all of my research. And so when I was looking at doing this research, my first thought was a general overview, but I quickly changed my approach And the reason why is that I understood that the earlier ideologies and the earlier theoretical concepts that even created Alachua County set the tone for race relations going forward, and that they began to change only through outer experience and things that happen externally that kind of quote unquote trickle down. And so it's this looking at broader themes and how it affected Alachua County and what they did from those theoreticals and then the practical implications that were put forth as a result. And so in that, when we look at race relations, particularly between blacks and whites in the state, and then narrowing the focus down with Alachua County, there are two basic premises that we can focus on, and that's economics and social control. And so we look at the earliest beginnings and when Alachua County was created during the territorial days and when Florida was merely a territory. And so when we start looking at those earlier relationships, we see it was divided amongst the ideas of the three groups of people that they had placed blacks in. And that was those black Seminoles, blacks in the company of Native Americans, which they often refer to just simply blacks in the company of, the enslaved, and then the free blacks that were in the area. And from that lens, they began to develop what we would now consider race relations. So with black Seminoles, it was an outright detrimental idea for them to allow black Seminoles to stay in the area and to stay in Alachua County, because they learned the lesson from the Negro Fort and Andrew Jackson telling them that as long as they continue to allow this relationship, then your enslaved will always yearn for freedom, and they will always seek solstice with the natives, and that relationship could be the ultimate detriment to Florida. And not only Florida, but again, when you synthesize it, they thought those same ideas for plantation society as a whole. And so for the enslaved, we understand that Florida is primarily a transplant state and still is, right? And so most of your enslaved people are coming from Carolina, they're coming from Georgia and Alabama and other places, even a little further, but not so much. And basically speculators are coming in and planters are looking in the area, and particularly in Middle Florida, which was considered the most fertile, and they're dividing it up and they're buying these large plots and lots of land. And then they're going home and they're giving the deeds to these lands to family members, particularly their sons. And they're telling them, go to Florida and make your way. And so they then take part of the enslaved community or the enslaved people that they have, and they bring them down into Florida with them. So we understand that the enslaved are transplanted as well. And so the idea that in order to build, because from the early first council, the idea was at some point we are going to become a state. And we cannot become a state until we get our numbers up for population, which was required by the government, and then a basic economic stability, which they, of course, considered plantation society as the bolster and the cornerstone. And so the enslaved who were brought in were basically given a magnanimous task of building a society and pushing this society from territory to statehood. So that meant there had to be more stringent control in order to extract the work that was needed to build. And then the third was those small numbers, but prevalent enough to be noticed, free blacks. And so the Legislative Council in 1825 decided that whatever free blacks that are in Florida, we will accept, but no more. And so Alachua County took on that idea, and they limited the number of free blacks that were already there, but then they used the Legislative Council of 1825 and their ruling in saying no more free blacks coming into the county, period. And so when you look then with the free blacks, we focus a little bit more on the economics. And what we find there is that Alachua County then created a rule that restricted the economics for free blacks in Alachua County. And the first rule that they did, and that's a quick prime example, is that on Sundays, that was a primary day for commerce. Saturday, people were moving in, getting things in, so that was a primary day too, but Sunday was also a primary day. They created the rule that free blacks could not sell commerce on Sundays. So that was the first restriction, making sure that free blacks couldn't compete and grow their community the same way that the whites would. And of course, there's the indication also of social control, right? Because on Sunday, that's also the day where people fraternize. They meet at the market, they talk. And so that limited their social interaction and enacted some forms of social control. And so we look at those types of early ideologies and those types of early measurements that were in place that set the tone going forward in race relations. And it began at the beginning. Alachua County is created in 1824. These measurements come down in 1825. And so as we move forward and we go through, of course, the enslavement period, and we get to the emancipation and the post-emancipation ideologies and theories, there's one primary that we see set the tone for the late 1800s. And it doesn't actually begin in Florida, but it is quickly adopted by Florida. The ideology actually comes from the state of Tennessee. And the state of Tennessee declared that they would continue to have, quote unquote, mastery over black lives. And that meant through social control and economics as well. And so Florida, as a southern state, agreed. And so we still see those relationships where things such as what we had enslaved codes now becoming black codes. And then we also see those organizations who are outside of the government that are used to enforce them. And of course, the most prominent is the KKK. And then, of course, the KKK comes into Florida as well, and into Alachua. And when the resurgence comes in the early 1900s, the Gainesville clavern is considered one of the most dangerous in the country. And so we understand that these ideologies continued on through. Now, as Florida, like I said, we're still looking at synthesizing things down. As Florida divides itself culturally between what is called Southern Florida and International Florida, we start seeing stark differences. Southern Florida is, of course, geographically north, and International Florida is basically South Florida. And of course, International Florida is given that name because of all of the different nationalities and ethnic groups that began to foster and actually become the cornerstone of the culture in geographically South Florida. But Northern Florida remains and holds on to those Southern ideas and those ideologies that were created through the enslavement period. And what probably is the strongest sentiment that was, or ideology that came out of some of the research by Professor Johnson, that created a book, wrote a book called Soul by Soul. And he comes to the idea that the society was built on the idea that a survival of one group would not exist without the suppression of another, and that how well they were able to suppress and extract work and economic gains was how they had considered whether their survival was going to continue. And so we see that moving throughout the sharecropping period and Jim Crow. And so when we get to the fight for equality, which of course is 100 years later after emancipation, just here, and I know I gotta wrap it up, but just here in Alachua County, research then starts to shift for me into going into more of those oral histories and comparing them with the actual documentation of the city ordinances and things of that nature. And so I have recently relied more on Dr. Bracy, who was the first African American to integrate and graduate from Gainesville High. And so I have I have once again asked her about giving me more information, because I've worked with her a few months ago in my HPEP program, where we take young African American high school students and we take them around Orlando and show them the different African American historical sites, and we bring in a guest lecturer. She was gracious enough to speak with the students for me. And so I'm engaging her again in looking from, again, that first concept, right, of providing that voice to the voiceless, and her giving her personal account of integrating Gainesville High and moving Alachua County past all of those post or prior negative race relations. And so At this point, 2 minutes, gotcha. At this point, from the civil rights movement forward, I'm looking at relying more on those oral histories and on those community projects and things of that nature, and placing it just opposed to the ideologies and the city ordinances and things of that nature. Because there's always the theoretical, but then the truth also sometimes lies in the practical, right? Thank you.
You actually had 1 minute left. Well, thank you so much. Thank you, again, thank you to our presenters. And before we open up the floor for questions, I would like to ask, as a chair, as a moderator here, my prerogative, I would like to actually ask the three of you, from where you sit, you have different ways, you all related to history. What do you consider the major challenge in terms of bringing and highlighting the histories that you have provided to the community and to the schools? And how do you think that could actually be, avoided? How can actually we teach better our histories that you actually have, provided? And what are the challenges? What are the major challenges that you see? Just briefly.
The biggest challenge is that the periods we talk about are so complicated, and there's so many things going on. They're embedded in so many different changes and who's in charge of colonies, that in some ways I think it's almost best when we're dealing with school kids to focus on an individual, like to tell the story of an individual in their times, because that's something that everybody can grasp without having to, without having to footnote it with 100 footnotes,
Right.
So that I think is one thing, is to tell the story of individuals and how they've lived in their time and what their challenges are.
Thank you. Dr. Landis.
I also think, public history, like Thomas Jackson and our Fort Mose Historical Society and others do, is one of the ways that children and adults they may not read my footnote of things again, but if they go to a museum and see an exhibit I worked on, or go to a public space, and I wrote a textbook for 4th grade history where I put all this in way back in the day. It's probably banned by now, but it was Macmillan McGraw-Hill. Textbooks, work with teachers in seminars through the public history groups, museums. All of that is one way you get it across. Documentaries, film, that kind of thing. They may not read all the details, but they'll get the big story.
Thank you. Dr. Dixon.
Yeah, I definitely want to piggyback on that. I think that what we also have to do is understand that we have to bridge the gap, right, between academia and the public. And the only way you're going to do that is be flexible enough to do that balance between giving them what they want and giving them what they need. And so in that, this is why I kind of moved out of the classroom and more into public history, because these exhibits, right? The theoretical is the exhibits are, but now we're at a time where even the exhibits have to keep up with the times, right? That we're so used to being on the phone and you got only a few minutes to give the information, get it, hold them long enough, because our attention span is getting shorter with these different memes and things of that nature, quick video clips. So you have to adapt to that. So your documentaries have to be on point, in and out. Your exhibits have to do the same thing, right? You have to give them, you have to cut the fat, give them the meat, but it also has to be in that form, that media form that everyone is now looking for. as we.
Thank you so much. So now I open up the floor. Please, I see 1, 2, 3 questions, 4. I think to make it easier and fine here, to make it easier, if you could actually address the person that you would like to actually address your question to, I will take the basket of 4 so that we move quickly rather than just take one person. So in that order, please. I have started here.
I have a comment.
Yes, go ahead.
And that is,
If you could stand, please, it's easier for the acoustics. And I don't think we have a speaker. No. Yes, please, if you can speak up.
I'll address it to Dr. Dixon. So one of the things I think as educators we can actually utilize this quote unquote short attention span and prolong it is to get those students engaged in a community project so that they really become invested in those community projects. And they do amazing things. They create little documentaries, they do all kinds of podcasts, all kinds of things that they do, but it gets them invested in it, not just looking at it.
Thank you. I think there was a question in the back, and then you had the question, and somebody else. Was it you, Colleen, who had the question? Please, go ahead.
Thank you. I think you just issued a call for freedom schools. I have questions for all three, but I'll just ask Dr. Cusick and give others a chance. I'm so glad that someone else mentioned General Jessup's evaluation that the Second Seminole War was a Negro and not an Indian war. Dr. Mary Rivers brought that up and talked about the massive flows of escaped people into Florida. So for Dr. Cusick, what was the impact of that admixture of runaways and at what point in time on the power and population amongst the Seminoles? And as on the Seminoles as cattlemen, was it literally cattlemen? Was there a gender division of labor amongst the Seminoles?
Thank you. And then I think there was a follow-up question here. Yes, Dr. please.
Thank you. Forgive me if I missed the discussion question before I came in. One of the panel could talk about the compromise votes in the 1876 presidential election that in the Reconstruction, and particularly, if possible, what informal role we give African American congressmen prior to that. Those prominent African American politicians had in that compromise.
Thank you. And there was one more question? Yes, go ahead, please.
My question was to Dr. Cusick, and we often talk about the Timucuan, and I heard you talk about the Potano, and I was trying to figure out the connection, if the Potano were a division of the Timucuan, and how do you define a Potano? How do you know they're not just a Timucuan, but they're a Potano?
Okay, I'll take the last one first because it's easier.
Yes, go ahead, please. Yes.
Oh, there was another question.
Oh, there was another question there. Go ahead, please.
The Seminole region, there were Seminoles who were enslaved. And my question is basically, there's a freedom movement that those particular descendants of people who were enslaved in the tribe. So since we're talking about Seminoles, did they actually give descendants of those particular Seminoles who was enslaved? The ones who are living now who were descendants, tribalized. And the other question I have is this. Seeing though Alachua County participated in slavery, does Alachua County also descendant reparation?
Thank you so much. So if we can go in the same order, we just take a few moments to reflect.
I'll take as many as I can.
Yes.
So on the Potano were Timucua-speaking people. And they are identified early on in the DeSoto Chronicles as the Patano, just like the Appalachia were identified as the Appalachia. So that name was given to them and the people that lived in this area. The people to the south were the Okap. The Patano generally were considered to be one of the two most powerful chiefdoms of the Temuco. The other was the Utina. And those were, oddly enough, were the two groups that fought, when the French were colonists here. So the Patano was actually a chiefdom. It was a political entity, it was a people, and it was a region. This was the Patano region. But their language was Temuco language. So they're part of the larger language group. Their question on was there a gender division in Seminole cattle breeding, that's easy for me to answer because I don't know the answer.
That's good. Okay, Dr. Landis, please.
There was a great exhibit too done on black cowboys, because Ocala still black cowboys from that period. But earlier, I didn't have time to get through the paper, but black women owned cattle and sold them too to the Spaniards. One of them was named Molly, and I've got her records about how that the sister of Bowlegs went into St. Augustine to testify on behalf of Juan Bautista Collins, the man I told you about, who was, French, Spanish, English speaking, trading in cattle, going everywhere. And she's testifying on his behalf in St. Augustine. So women were very, very involved, could hold their own property. I doubt they were out there herding the cattle, but they were selling them. So they may have even had enslaved people doing their labor for them. I don't know.
Thank you, Dr. Landis. Dr. Dixon, please.
Just to piggyback, I think they kind of covered it, but there were definitely Seminole women who had power and authority. And one in particular was Brooker woman, who had her entire own village. It was her village. And she did have enslaved people. But here's the thing I always want to make sure that people understand. It's kind of resonating what you were saying earlier. The word slave or enslaved had two very different connotations when it came down to the English and when it came down to Native Americans, right? And the idea of enslaving someone and then their children and their children's children also belong to you in servitude was not something that Native Americans believed in. They did not believe that your children automatically are going to go up to work for us as well. And then there was also the concept, and we saw this a lot during the Second Seminole War, where Seminole Native Americans understood how powerful the idea of chattel slavery and ownership was to planters and to plantation society. So we see in cases where they are actually claiming their children, their grandchildren, and even their friends as their slaves or their enslaved in order to keep them in the village. And we also see instances where those who were given, as enslaved earlier on, elevate themselves. There was always the chance, just like in Spanish society, there was always the chance to elevate yourself. And especially if you were a woman and had a child, or you were a man and somehow had a relationship with a Native American woman, then your child belonged to the clan. Your child was a clan member. And so that definitely meant that your child was not considered enslaved because they now belong to a clan.
Thank you. We'll take another round of questions.
Oh, I'm sorry, were we supposed to answer all round? I'm sorry, can I say one more thing here?
Oh, I thought you had taken that one too. Yes.
All round. With the Compromise of 1877, with that, African American congressmen found themselves in a very tight position, right? And I'll give you a good example. Ferdinand here, McLeod, when he won his election, Florida refused to even give him his seat. So that's why I'm saying there's always the theoretical and the practical. Theoretically, he won the election, but Florida refused to give him the seat. And when Florida refused to give him the seat, the government couldn't recognize him. And so he had to go through a full process. And so when we talk about the Compromise of 1877, it came down to, you know, the overall idea was that, you know, we couldn't tell who won. Democrats were cheating, Republicans were cheating, we can't tell who won the election. But when they got down to the compromise, and what we understood was that the Southern Democrats, who had at this point a very powerful piece in this country and in the government in itself, only wanted one thing. And if you look at the compromise, they compromised 4, 5 things to only one thing that they held on to, and that was the removal of the military district. All they wanted was the U.S. military to stop protecting blacks, because again, that concept that I spoke of earlier, that concept of mastery over black lives, was the primary issue. It was their issue for economics. It was their issue for social control. And so black politicians were not in a position to actually do much countering when you had white Republicans who simply wanted the Oval Office. And their cry for the Oval Office was more important than the black issue.
Thank you so much again. So we'll take just another quick question from there. Yes. And then you have the second one. We have 2 more questions from here. Somebody else who hasn't asked a question, please. Anybody else? Okay, we'll take your colleague again.
I just want to say thank you for the 3 panelists there. I know all 3 of them, and they always seem to give me some new information every time I hear them. But I wanted to just get your opinion on, all 3 of your opinions on, it was recently the state of Florida established a task force to look at establishing a Black History Museum. And we talk about Black history, we talk about African American history, not just about African American history. So I'm wondering, how can you tell Black history from beginning to end? I say end because it doesn't mean keep going. But how do we tell that history from the British, the Spanish, the American, and all those in between, and give a comprehensive look so we can impart that? I know in Dr. Dixon, we talk about capitalizing it. I think the kids more or less, they relate more to TikTok than they do to encyclopedia. But how do we tell that story from beginning to end, Black history, and make it relate to the other kids?
Thank you. Yes, you have to put your hand up. Yes.
So my question is specific to Dr. Lander's comment about the red paper. Probably no record and documents, but children might make printed boxes of dolls or even use paper for artwork, if there's ever any mention. Pretty awesome. Question.
Thank you for that question. Again.
I want to ask Dr. Dixon. Well, first I want to say, you said Black history from the beginning. You're going back 200,000 years. And Dr. Dixon, can you tell us a little bit about what your work with Tamu Pumpkin River?
Thank you. Yes. Do you want to? We'll start with you this time, Dr. Dixon, and come this way.
Okay. Task force question and the Black History Museum. First thing that came to mind was balance, right? We have to have a balance. If we create a state museum, and we had the same conversation years ago when we were creating, we knew NAMIC was coming with the Smithsonian, the National Museum of African American History and Culture on the mall. Same idea was, how do we tell a broad story, but at the same time provide a way that people will want to go back to their local state African American museums, local African American museums, and get more background information, especially in their own state, and something that may include their own community, right? And so that's the first balance that I think we have to have, right? If we have a state African American museum, then we have to theoretically have that balance. And in my idea, which we put forward years ago as well, we have to have that temporary exhibit, but it's a permanent temporary exhibit that lets various regions, cities, however you want to do it, the smaller African American museums that have been doing the work for all of these years give the details so that people will want to go, so that that specific information can still be made available. Now, the second part, and I'm still on balance, right, is balancing that historical overview versus your topics, and then how we're going to put them in a form that young people and people alike will attract to. And that is, we provide them with the ability to give the broad strokes, but broad strokes enough to have them interested, and then practically use the technology. With these, the idea of QR codes and things of that nature, I think we need to expand on that, so that, because they'll put their phone right there and get the QR code if they really are interested, and then give them more of that information, give them more pictures, give them more information, even maybe a quick video clip. But these are the things that they're used to seeing, these are the things that they're going to be more attractive to. So you have both things taken care of, right? You can give them the broad, but then you give them the ability to stay in contact, stay tuned, and lock in to a specific issue.
Thank you, Dr. Dixon.
I was going to follow up on what Jim said about going through individuals and real life people. And one of the museums I'm working with now in Tennessee has the most wonderful new exhibit. It was where Andy Jackson, by the way, hung out at the tavern. But they have portraits up all over the walls. And when you walk in, it triggers a video to come out and the person begins to speak to you. So the bartender who served Andy Jackson, or the woman who owned slaves, or the indigenous person who started it, telling their stories that the historians have written for them, but it really is like they're alive, they're holograms, and it's really a wonderful thing that would and do the short term, as Thomas talked about, was, I think that's the coming thing, probably.
Dr. Cusick, you have something to add?
Only that I find that my experience at the library at UF is that when students of any age come in, they're coming in to get help with projects and look at resources and stuff. But a lot of times, what they end up doing is gaining some sort of rapport with the librarian. And so I think when you're thinking about your museum, don't forget about people. That your biggest asset might not be what's hanging on the wall. It might be the people that are doing the greeting and talking to everyone and keeping in contact with them, because that's actually, I think, a lot of times what brings history alive for people, is that they've actually got a person that they're talking to.
I forgot about the red paper.
Oh, yes, yeah, I was going to remind you real quickly, red paper, right.
Just about the red paper, color in itself is a vocabulary. And so for different African groups that I study, colors mean something. So red would, if I'm in Cuba, red and white is Shango, and I would know exactly what that meant. Yellow is something else, blue is something else. And so I don't know if it's also true in indigenous cultures, but I think so, because certain beads are valued and adopted, and others are passed over. And the same thing in the enslaved African trade and the underwater archaeology that we see. It didn't sell in Africa because nobody wanted it. You're going to find it at the bottom of the ocean.
I'll throw one funny story in there if I can.
Quickly, please.
Yeah, there's a story that all the land grants, colonial land grants in St. Augustine, were kept in a chamber, a room on the plaza, and that the kids in St. Augustine used to sneak in there, and because they were looking for paper to make kites with, and they would steal the land grants and make them into kites and fly them around. And so I think there's also the fact that kids just like paper.
On that note, I would like to thank our esteemed keynote presenters, Dr. Cusick, Dr. Landers, Dr. Dixon. Thank you, you did an amazing job this morning. Thank you so much. And thank you.
We are going to take about 5 minutes break, use the restroom, have some coffee, and look at the posters all around. All these posters were done by my interns for more than a year, collecting data on the Black communities in Alachua County. Some of them are called Black History Makers. So 5 minutes, we'll have the panel right back. Don't go away.